Alright, we're going to start out by sewing a French seam. Got two pieces of fabric. These are just 4 by 8. These ones don't have a right side, really. But with a typical French seam, we start by sewing wrong sides together. Usually we begin by sewing right sides together for just a regular seam, but for this we're going to be sewing wrong sides together because it is an enclosed seam. And anytime you have a true enclosed seam, you begin by sewing wrong sides together. So I'm first going to sew a seam that is a 1/4 inch wide. I'm actually going to go a titch smaller than a 1/4 inch, so and that'll make sense why I do that in just a second. So I'm going to sew a seam that is a titch less wide than the 1/4 inch. So I'm going to give myself a back stitch, which is going to lock my stitches into place. I'm just going to go ahead and sew my seam at a 1/4 inch. The next thing that I need to go do is iron some things. So next I'll go iron, and we'll be right back. To press the French seam, first I'm going to have my seam line sticking straight up here. And remember, it's just shy of a 1/4 inch. And I'm going to press that seam open. And we always, regardless of whether we're ultimately going to press the seam all one direction or not, later, we always press it open first. And the reason for that is because it helps embed the stitches, and it makes it so that we can prevent seam wells. And seam wells basically mean that when I flip to the other side of the fabric, when I fold along my seam line here, it means that I won't have the seam tucked down inside and create a weird little gap. So we always press the seams open first. So on the French seam, I've pressed it open. Now I'm going to take my fabric and I'm just going to fold it along my seam line. And I'm enclosing between the layers, I'm enclosing that raw edge. So I'm now actually folding it right sides together. So I began sewing wrong sides together, and now I'm folding the fabric so that it's right sides together, so that when I go back and sew it again, I will enclose all of that inside, and my fabric will be right sides together. So let's go stitch it. To finish out the French seam, remember we've got our raw edges sandwiched right sides together between my layers of fabric. Now I'm going to come in and I'm going to do a thread's width bigger than a 1/4 inch. Since when I first sewed, I went just shy of a 1/4 inch. Now I'm going to go just shy above a 1/4 inch. And the reason I'm doing that is to make sure that any raw edges, that were perhaps a bit thready, get tucked in a little bit easier. Make sure that you're back stitching at the beginning and the end. We always do that, unless we're doing like gathers or something like that, that we need to have it not tied a knot. But if it's supposed to stay there long term, it needs to have a back stitch at the beginning, at the end. Now all we need to do is go and press this open, and our French seam is done. So let's go press it open. The final press on the French seam, so this is the wrong side of the fabric I'm looking at. I've got my French seam, everything's enclosed on the right side of the fabric, or the outside of the fabric. It just looks like a regular seam. But if I was using a really lightweight, gauzy looking fabric that I could see seam lines through the outside of it, so if there's a slight shear factor to the fabric, having a French seam makes a really beautiful finish on a hem, because people looking at it from the right side of the fabric, all they'll see is a nice enclosed edge here. And you're just going to press it one direction or the other. Just make sure that you've got it tugged well enough that you don't have any seam wells on the outside. That's the French seam.